Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a really huge economic question, one that's based on some absolutely fascinating new research. Is the world getting more expensive simply because it's becoming less connected?
I mean, you've probably heard the argument, right? The conventional wisdom seems pretty simple. As countries start pulling back, building up walls, and choosing to trade with friends instead of whoever's the most efficient, well, costs are going to go up. The logic seems to be that this will just inevitably lead to higher inflation for all of us.
But what if that simple story isn't the whole story? What if it's missing a massive counteracting force? Well, a new study is challenging this entire assumption, and that is exactly what we are going to break down today. So our analysis is all based on staff working paper number 1146 from the Bank of England. It's titled Trade Fragmentation, Inflationary Pressures, and Monetary Policy, and it's by Ludovica Ambrosino, Jenny Chan, and Silvana Tenbrero. And the paper asks this really critical question. As the world's trade networks start to break apart, what's the true effect on inflation, and what's the right way for central banks to respond? Right from the get-go, the paper's abstract gets to the very heart of the issue. The authors argue that the impact on inflation doesn't just depend on rising import prices. It crucially, and that's their word, depends on how aggregate demand, that's you and me and everyone else, how we adjust our spending when our real incomes and our purchasing power start to fall. This right here is the central idea we're going to explore. So how do you even begin to test a question this big? Well, the researchers built a really sophisticated economic model to simulate the real world. Then they threw different kinds of fragmentation shocks at it, just to see what would happen. Let's take a look at their tooltip. Okay, first things first, let's make sure we're on the same page with this key term, trade fragmentation. Look, this isn't just about a few new tariffs. It's this broad shift away from a world that's always looking for the cheapest product, no matter where it's from, to a world that prioritizes things like geopolitical alliances and security, even if that means things cost a little more. And this isn't some far-off hypothetical future. It's a trend that's been building for over a decade now. This timeline here, it shows that after decades of just rising and rising, global trade as a piece of the economic pie basically stalled out right around the 2008 financial crisis. This kicked off what some people are calling the era of globalization. And if you need more proof, check this out. This fragmentation index really confirms the trend. As you can see, the index was pretty flat for decades and then boom, right after the 2008 crisis, it starts climbing, and it's accelerated even more in just the last few years. Now, to analyze this new reality, the authors built this really smart economic model. It's got goods that are traded internationally, like, say, cars, and stuff that isn't, like haircuts. It simulates what happens when global trade gets disrupted. But the real secret sauce, the real innovation, is in how it models different kinds of people. See, they use what's called a two-agent New Keynesian model, or TANK for short. And this is a huge leap forward from older rank models, which honestly were a little unrealistic. They just assumed everyone in the economy is a perfect planner with tons of savings. The TANK model gets us much, much closer to reality by including different types of households. And here is why that is so incredibly important. The TANK model has two distinct groups. Planners, who have savings and can kind of smooth out the bumps when shocks happen, and spenders, who are basically living hand to mouth and have to adjust their spending immediately based on what they're earning right now. Understanding this difference is really the key to the entire study. All right, so the model is built. Now let's put it to the test. The researchers ran 3 totally different scenarios to see how different kinds of fragmentation could shake up the economy. First up, let's imagine a slow burn. This is a scenario where the cost of imported stuff doesn't jump overnight, but instead, it just slowly, steadily, and permanently creeps up. You can think of this like global supply chains gradually rerouting to more expensive but friendlier countries over a few years. Okay, so this sets up this incredible economic tug-of-war. On one side, you have the supply shock. That's inflationary, just like you'd think. Higher import costs push prices up. But on the other side, you get this really powerful disinflationary demand effect. See, as things get more expensive, our real incomes fall. We have less purchasing power, so we cut back on spending, and that pulls prices down. In this scenario, the model shows the demand effect. The downward pull actually wins out. So think about that. The key finding here is that under a gradual fragmentation, the biggest threat isn't actually runaway inflation. No,
It's economic stagnation, a long, drawn-out period of weak consumer demand and an economy that's just stuck in the mud. Now for scenario number 2. What if the change isn't gradual? What if it's a sudden, sharp shock? Like a trade war breaks out and massive tariffs get slapped on everything overnight.
Here, the balance of forces is completely different. That inflationary supply shock hits like a tidal wave, just instantly driving up costs. Now, the drop in consumer demand still happens as our incomes fall, but it takes a little more time to fully ripple through the economy. So for a short period, that inflationary shock from the supply side wins the tug of war. And the result is a short but really nasty period of stagflation. And that is the worst of both worlds, right? Prices are going up, but at the same time, economic growth and our consumption are falling. That is a major, major headache for central banks to try and manage. Okay, the final scenario looks at a different angle. What if fragmentation doesn't just raise the price of what we buy, but it also makes our own export industries less productive over time? Maybe because they lose access to global markets and the best technologies. Well, in this case, those competing pressures are a lot more balanced. Yeah, lower productivity is inflationary because it just costs more to produce the same stuff. But because the hit to our household income is less severe than in the other scenarios, that downward pull from weaker demand is much, much milder. So, after running through those 3 potential futures, what's the big picture? What is the real story that this research is telling us about fragmentation and inflation? The key takeaway is that you have to think of fragmentation as a two-sided coin. The conventional wisdom, the story you always hear, it only focuses on step 1, that inflationary supply shock. But this paper's crucial insight is that you absolutely cannot ignore step 2, that powerful disinflationary hit to consumer demand. The authors say it best themselves in their conclusion. The net impact on inflation is, and I'm quoting here, a priori ambiguous. Now, in plain English, that just means you can't know for sure ahead of time whether fragmentation is going to be inflationary or not. The simple story we all started with, it's just too simple. And that leaves us with this final, really provocative question. As our world continues to rewire all of its trade relationships, is it possible that the biggest economic threat we face isn't that everything will get more expensive, but that our entire economic engine will just slow down? In this new era, maybe stagnation is the bigger dragon we need to slay, not inflation.